and the two should overlap, and that will drive a market response, which means reuse less of the damaging activity or resource. Great. Nice and simple, maybe a slightly unusual way of illustrating it. I think all of you can see the basic point. So, just another little quote. You will discover that I'm mainly using quotes that I actually disagree with, just for sort of a rhetorical effect. So that's what I've just shown you, but I've added in what an attempt to build a global reference point in the Stern-Stiglitz Commission, which said, and roughly speaking, amidst all of the huge uncertainties, we should be looking at a carbon price of somewhere between $40 to $80 per tonne CO2 and rising over time. So that's the kind of the benchmark of are we serious? And what I've just shown you. Therefore, we want that as a carbon price. Also, they landed on that not just through externality evaluation, because that's the kind of carbon price which will change things, as we have seen from Ian's talk. Okay? But first have to bear in mind the impacts are borne by very different people than the carbon price. So it's worth stepping to say, okay, so where are we in this? And we all know that, right? I mean, the dotted line is basically future generations and other countries predominantly, or it's our future selves, whereas the purple line is actually people paying a carbon price today. Well, one thing actually I note is, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty, and we do have alternate estimates, which interestingly didn't come up there, okay. As you probably know, the US administration was not fond of the Clean Power Plan. When they rejected it, their legal and economic case for doing so was not about climate science. It was nothing to do with the very first slide that our chair showed. They said, climate science, well, you know, National Academy, whatever, well, yeah, okay. They changed two economic parameters and got a completely different answer. And I hope at least some in the audience will know precisely what they did. And well, a lot of us are not very happy about it. But they kind of did it. They said, we're the administration, we can define how we do the analysis. And also we look at Ian's figure, which, bear in mind, this is 30 years after this issue came officially onto the political agenda with establishment of the IPCC and actually at the time, the US administration and its economists and many economists around the world saying, we need a carbon price. 30 years. And what's the global average carbon price? It's $1. Right? Now, I'm an empiricist. I think that matters, and I think we really need to take note of it, and not just sort of keep banging the same drum and expecting a radically different outcome. And the theme of my talk really is, you know how often in detective stories, the brilliance of the detective is not that they're hammering on and on and on and on and on at exactly the same thing. They're saying, hang on a minute, let's look around. What else can we think about that others haven't actually looked at? What is it we're not looking at that could help us? So I want to look at those other things. I said it partly in the context of the European policy. I think you will nearly all know that Europe's climate policy was framed for 2020 in terms of 3 targets: greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. There was actually another around interconnectors. And a lot of people, both business and economists, said that's pretty crazy. I mean, why have 3 targets for 1 objective? Dumb idea, inefficient, overlapping, actually damages the EU ETS, which should be the prime instrument, etc. So, huge chorus of criticism. So the EU went away, thought carefully, looked at all the evidence, and for its 2030 strategy, it said, we'll do this. It's 3 targets again, plus 1. They're more ambitious targets, they've moved. So, I think there's then a question, basically, is the EU dumb, or is the EU policy process capturing important things that maybe have been overlooked in at least classical economics? So, is there any rational case for not 1 but 3? Let me come back to this chart. You've seen this. I'm now going to amend it or actually, I'm going to leave it exactly the same, but I'm going to add some crosses to the left. Those crosses are basically what I, in my lifetime and my research, regard as reality, which is I haven't met anybody who's a perfect optimizer. I haven't met any company that is perfectly deploying its resources. I haven't met any government that has perfect policies. I don't know anybody who's at the frontier. Almost everything in real life is inframarginal. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. We had a great session yesterday afternoon in this room, and the session was basically all about this stuff, why reality is to the left of the frontier. Why, let's face it, probably how many woke up this morning and thought, I'm going to optimize my energy use today. Well, we kind of have other things to do, right? But it's more than that. So actually reality is to the left of the frontier in general terms. Economics has known this for 50, 60 years. It's been called satisficing behavior. Some others call it common sense. I call it for specificity, a first domain of economics, which starts from how do real people, companies, organizations, and governments behave, just for sort of clarity and generalization of the terminology. That leaves the domain where one is assuming that you have rational optimizing agents with, if not perfect foresight, at least rational expectations, etc. Optimizing behavior is second domain economics. Now onto the other thing, that curve moves. It moves over time. We all know that, thank goodness. We usually consider it productivity gains, technology advance, etc., which means we get more out of less or more out of the same. Good. What is really interesting, though, is particularly given a global long-term externality, we care about how that curve moves. Actually, what we've seen with high oil prices for a period was tremendous innovation in ways to mess up the atmosphere a lot more cheaply through lots of fantastic innovation around tar sands and coal to liquids, etc. We care about the direction of innovation. We care about its pace because it's good economics, but we also absolutely care about its direction. So we're an issue of innovation, where that frontier moves. We care about where it's moving to. How do we shape it? What do we do about that? And that's transforming behavior. Now, this all has some actually pretty clear theoretical foundations. I don't have time to go into depth at all, but the middle one is the terrain that I think all of you would know. And I just summarise there the underlying assumptions of those theories. Broadly, what the whole of yesterday afternoon was about was behavioural and touched a bit on organisational theory, which is shed loads, myopia, habits, risk aversion, contractual failure, tenant-landlord, principal-agent, da-di-da-di-da-di-da. All of the above is captured in terms of satisficing. And then in the third domain, you're talking about evolutionary and institutional economics, which have also been around for a long time, in which there's technological and structural change and institutional and behavioural change, typically from innovation, infrastructure, etc., etc. And that broadly, shorthand, we call the transformative domain of economics. The central point of this whole work, which came out along with some co-authors, was to stress we're not interested in warfare between these different theories. They're all right. They are all true, but they describe different bits of the elephant. And in particular, by and large, you have a progression of both time scales and social scales. So broadly, the behavioral economics literature is at the micro level, it's individuals, it's organizational structures. Market neoclassical theory is representative agents of larger scale market aggregate behaviors, maybe national market structures, and whereas behavioral economics is frequently looking at months, if that, in terms of time and myopia, markets maybe a couple of years to a couple of decades. And the third domain is broadly about long-term structural changes, which can take decades to centuries if you look at urban planning, and which broadly involve the global spread of technologies. And even the most profitable energy technologies, like the discovery of oil, took 3/4 of a century to diffuse. So all of these are true. They're describing different bits of the problem. We need, therefore, approaches that deal with all of them. And note the first and third of those have quite a lot of interesting things in common, and they're non-linear and they're not inherently optimizing. Two things to stress. What happens depends quite heavily on government policy. And secondly, progress is largely irreversible. The costs tend to be transitional, not enduring. So if you move closer to the frontier, you become more efficient, you save money and emissions, why would you go back again? You make new innovations or major infrastructural investments like a better designed urban city, or for that matter, insulating your loft. Energy prices could go to zero and I wouldn't take the insulation out of my loft and I wouldn't change my urban design. So these things are largely transitional costs with enduring consequences. I don't have time to go in it. There's a mathematical, and that was a point I think was missed in yesterday's session on behavioural stuff. There is a mathematical annex in the book. We've actually recently published a working paper in Cambridge, which is being presented in a couple of weeks, on how much this may change the structure you're looking at. So just to stress, though, you've just seen this. All I want to say is, one thing I really like about this is you can see the equilibrium economics bit in there, and it's very important, but it's now nested in a dynamics framework. You're not stuck saying, well, it's kind of one equilibrium and one day we need to hop to a new equilibrium. It's saying the curve evolves. It will be influenced by how close actors really get to the curve, which will generate markets and pressures for better ways of doing that stuff, and how fast we push the curve forward. And the markets need to evolve and keep up with that evolution. So if I move on to a bit about specific policy, it tends to look like this. Again, a quote about the way economists normally look at things. Actually, I argue that, sure, where you are dealing with optimizing domain behavior, then markets and prices tend to be the best way of allocating resources, etc. High relevance. They may have impacts on the other domains. If you put up the price of energy fast enough and high enough, you may well kick people out of satisficing to take notice of how much energy they're wasting. Unfortunately, they'll probably vote you out of office first. And that is reality. So the nice thing is, when you're dealing with that kind of satisficing behavior, you want to go to the instruments that work, like product standards or direct engagement and enabling policies. Effectively, you're trying to facilitate smarter individual and corporate choices. If you are after strategic transformation, then as Caroline has said, well, these are areas where by definition the public returns are bigger than the private returns. So of course you've got to subsidize it to get an efficient outcome. So, against that backdrop, you can see, I think there's a perfectly rational case for multiple pillars of policy. What's happened in practice, to try and sort of make a little bit of this more practical? Well, UK and Germany, two countries maybe I know best of all in this space, they've all had three-pillar policies. They may not have called it that, but all have. But they have differed in emphasis. I don't have time to go into it. They have both benefited from some like European product standards, which have been high economic and environmental value. The UK's tended to lay more emphasis upon near-term cost effectiveness, cost minimisation. The German approach more on the strategic transformation side of it. The UK more on carbon pricing, etc. So to the UK story, where has that got us? Now I'm going to have to grab this water. It's been dramatic. UK coal burn is that wiggly line, and it's gone down dramatically, particularly as we've seen the carbon price there, the green EU ETS price, now the UK carbon price floor. The essential point is we actually had fairly high carbon prices for a period, didn't make a vast difference. Now they've made a huge difference with the price floor, fundamentally because the carbon price drives operational change but not efficiency or investment. And now we have lower carbon price, lower gas price, coal differential, and we have cut electricity demand, and we have ramped up renewable energy. So the space is squeezed, we've flipped the merit order and basically killed coal out of the system. but it is carbon price in combination with other things. The German story is broadly captured by the pace of progress in renewables. The red there is the extraordinary cost reductions in PV. The left is the quotes that I disagree with, including saying that solar in Germany makes as much sense as growing pineapples in Alaska. I don't have time to go into the innovation chain that underlies all this, but just a little bit of data. Global deployment of PV has been astonishingly dominated by just two countries, Japan and then Germany coming in over the top of that. We've pulled together some data on this. We're still doing the full analysis. We're assuming that you'd have a 5% a year exogenous technology cost reduction, but that still leaves a massive role for the learning by doing, the scale economies, the supply chain development, everything that's gone along with that deployment, which actually is really what has driven that extraordinary cost reduction, which in turn has, of course, transformed the prospects for global low-carbon development. And roughly speaking, if you try and do a cost-benefit appraisal of the German Energiewende, then it looks something like this. I don't want to attach specific numbers to it yet, a lot of contingencies. But broadly, yeah, it's negative if you assume it's German only and you're not taking account of carbon value. On the others, it's plausibly to probably positive. And if you're taking a global perspective, including carbon pricing, it's massively positive. So, in my view, it wasn't growing solar pineapples in Alaska. It was planting PV in the fertile soil of a country which actually had the industrial, financial, and political capability to drive a technology revolution of global benefit. This chart, I really don't have time to go into. It's away. Some of you will have seen it in other work that Carsten Neuhoff and I have done. It basically says, what's this crazy discussion about technologies or carbon pricing? I think Caroline has laid that out very well to a large degree. Clearly, the more you have a carbon price, the more valuable all of your low carbon innovation will be. Here, this example shows something that starts twice as high as current conventional, and then you buy down the costs with investment in the top left quadrant through technology policies. Try and do that with a carbon price, you would have to more than double energy prices. And I was astonished when I talked about this, and someone said, oh, don't bother with all this third domain strategic investment stuff, that's messy, it's governments. You just need a bloody big carbon price. We were in Washington. I don't know what planet this person lived on, but the idea that you were going to get several $100 carbon price as realistic or more efficient than a focused technology policy, I just thought. Anyway, so I am now pretty much at conclusions. I had a fair amount of ground to cover. You've already seen the top three rows. The result still depends upon how you evaluate it. The UK approach has been far more cost-effective and over-delivered our 2020 target. But maybe the next steps and deeper are looking harder. The German approach has unquestionably been more costly and under-delivered their 2020 target, but it's had huge innovation, and deeper reductions in the future are now clear and more cost-effective and indeed embedded in the German system. Which is right? Well, my opening quote, tell me which is male, which is female. And I think we kind of need both of them. And they actually go very well together. Probably not many countries can or should follow the German example, but that's kind of what's needed. I think I need to skip this one. It basically says these three pillars, in my view, are all intimately interrelated and they can all help each other. And that is how we can get to a serious carbon price. And this is simply the summary, along with the fundamental point. Why did we get driven down this framework? And it's basically because we are dealing with a problem which I think is almost unique in scope, which is one that spans not only traditional markets, but it expands the, frankly, very inattentive and uninterested decision-making of 7 billion people on the planet at one extreme, who don't go out and buy their latest exciting bit of energy and pay attention to it. At the other extreme, to the long-term transformation of some of the most complex systems humanity's ever invented. And it's not surprising therefore, that we need tools beyond the classical economics. We need the behavioral economics and organizational economics. We need the evolutionary institutional economics. Personally, Caroline, I no longer talk to them about failures, because I think they just inhabit part of the space in their own right and their own legitimacy and their own theories and their own policies. But the key certainly is to match them all together. And I included at the bottom there the concluding stanza of that song, "We're different, therefore equal." I'll put up a quick advert from the image.
So thank you. So we have some time left for the audience to have a discussion. So I would like to invite the three introductory speakers to our table, and then go into the audience and see what this has brought as new ideas. Because I think finally we have a very complementary story to tell. If you look at the three different speakers.
That way you still have a glass.
Okay, we have a microphone here, so I will. So who? Let's see. Yeah, it works. Who is having a question for the speakers? Yes, to this side and there. So I will walk a little bit around myself. Here.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all three speakers. I have a question for Michael Group. And it's a very generic question. So you were talking about the need to have an integrative, to integrate all the all economic frameworks. But when we look at how economics is taught across the world, we see actually there is a lot of competition in which theoretical frameworks to apply in seeing real world. Some institutes are very proudly neoclassical economic institutes. Some institutes are very proudly evolutionary neoclassical economics. Sorry. Some institutions are very fond of their institutional economics approach. So how would you convince everyone to adopt your view, in fact, that actually, yeah, all the views are an integrated view of all the theoretical approaches are necessary to really understand the real world?
You only want Michael to answer your question? I think the question is also interesting for the other two, isn't it?
He mentioned the topic.
Okay, Michael?
Well, I suspect not just the panel, but there's lots of people in the audience who are better qualified than I to answer that.
So let's keep it short, and then we
go. I think the key.
No, that's important because we have many questions.
No, but it's really important. To me, the key is humility. I do not think there is a single theory which describes the whole reality of economics. It's as simple as that. If you understand the boundaries around a given theory and you accept those boundaries, you stop saying other people are stupid because they're not doing this. It might dawn on you, well, they're looking at a different part of the problem, and that's equally legitimate. Maybe the only thing I could add is tracing where one can help the other. So, for example, the political obstacles to carbon pricing are really driven by distributional impacts. Energy, and my Russian colleague says economists have it completely the wrong way around. Prices don't drive efficiency. Efficiency creates the political space for proper pricing. So, understanding those interactions maybe helps.
Mm-hmm. Ian, maybe of Caroline, let's see what you think about it. Is it necessary to have a broader approach? That's basically your question, that there is also this student movement which also calls for different perspective on economics. What do you think? We need this?
Well, I think, so in my work, what I'm trying to do is take more the classical model and translate these other concerns into that, because it's very easy to understand in the framework of other market failures and other, a lot of the classical results rely on a great deal of assumptions about other markets working perfectly. And so I think that's a way that
standard economists can understand a lot of these other constraints, then accept that these assumptions don't hold. And we have to convince them that it's actually really important to take them into account into our models, because the results can become quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You satisfied? Okay. Let's continue. You had a question?
No, but I
okay.
could make a remark if you're right.
A remark, okay.
Just to add on top of that, I made a similar remark this week in a roundtable session about the missing link. And Michael, what you said finally relates me, if we talk international economics, to new trade theory. Paul Krugman's New Economic Geography, where we don't have equilibria anymore. So basically we benefited a lot in the 1990s from the general equilibrium modelings. They pushed us forward in the whole climate debate. And now, what you propose, or if I try to interpret it, we need to develop a disequilibrium, kind of a disequilibrium theory. It might be also to teach this to our students. So we are on a permanent way away from the equilibria or between the different disequilibria. How can we deal this in the models? Ian and Caroline.
Okay, you want to answer? Yeah, I also want to add something. I read Acemoglu's paper about endogenous innovation, and I think that's just perfect neoclassical economics in a sense, and it captures nicely the combined papers of Ian Perry and Caroline Fisher. So it's also a question: where are we talking precisely about? I don't know, but maybe is it really necessary to have a new kind of view? Maybe on policy instruments and the discussions on policy instruments, we tend to frame that in the classical, the neoclassical way, where we have one market failure or two market failures. But there are excellent papers about nth types of market failures. So for me, it's a bit puzzling whether it would add so much to the discussion. But maybe you have a different view on this. There's a panel.
Ian, you were trained in Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, I guess for me, the bottom line is countries have these commitments, and basically, what do they need to put in place to meet these commitments? And it boils down to, what's the price responsiveness of fossil fuels? And maybe markets are responding efficiently. Maybe there's some inefficient behavior, which implies the elasticity is smaller. But to me, the bottom line is, what are the elasticities? Because they then determine what prices you need to meet your pledge. And whether, when we're assessing these elasticities, we allow for the possibility of some satisficing behavior or whatever. I mean, that's fine. I would take a broad perspective of the literature and saying, well, that these studies are assuming efficient markets, these studies are assuming some imperfections, but we sort of like take a midpoint across the literature on the behavioral responses. So from my perspective, that the bottom line is how responsive are fossil fuels to a pricing, to infer what prices countries need to meet their commitments. And then, well, a second point is, yes, you want to buttress the carbon pricing with these other instruments to get at broader market failures in innovation markets and so on. And I think to me that raises an issue of the choice of the pricing instrument, in the sense that a carbon tax is more compatible with other instruments than a pure trading system, because a pure trading system just fixes the quantity of emissions. So if you have other instruments that promote R&D or renewables or whatever, in the presence of a fixed cap on emissions, their only impact is to reduce the emissions price but not affect emissions. So in that sense, the pure trading system is not compatible with other instruments, whereas you don't have that issue under a carbon tax, which fixes the price but allows other instruments to enhance the reductions in emissions. So to me, that's another important issue, that to the extent we're having these other policies, you may want to, that implies, in my view, a preference for carbon taxes or a tax-like a scheme rather than a pure quantity scheme.
I thought the comments, the two comments, actually raise a very fundamental question, which I've struggled with a bit. And I'll make two remarks. One is almost philosophical, and in my inaugural professorial lecture at UCL, I had a slide which said, reality is not a market failure. Kind of got some interesting reactions. But it's kind of making a point, which is, what does it do to us if we try to define everything relative to an ideal which we know never actually exists? And in the book, we draw the obvious analogy with physics, which is, for 2 centuries we thought Newtonian mechanics described the universe, and then we kind of looked really small and had to get quantum mechanics, and then we looked really big and got relativity. And, Einstein did not say, well, relativity is a failure of Newtonian mechanics and we should bloody well get on and fix it. Just said, well, this is the reality we observe. So I think it does make a bit of a philosophical difference how you frame this, about, if you like, the legitimacy and are you trying to do something which is very difficult to reduce to purely fixing that failure and fixing that failure. The other is much more substantive, which is, and this is where I think it really matters in policy terms, it's the difference between marginal-based analysis based on partial derivatives of whatever it is you're trying to optimize, versus an overall analysis based on the total derivative of what you're trying to optimize. So if you take Ian's comment about local air pollution, again, you resorted to the fact, well, these countries, only Chile actually gets the pricing right. My view is, well, we're in a game of transformation, and when you transform something, you transform lots of things at the same time. Why would you expect it to be efficient for China to go down a route of, well, we've got a sulfur problem, let's desulfurize, and then we've got another problem here, and we'll move the coal plants further away, and got another problem here, and we're going to need to close the damn things anyway. Why not just sort out all the problems at the same time through transforming your energy industry? And that, I think, is where framing it as more than just market failure is actually quite useful and relevant in policy terms. It focuses you upon the multiple objectives that you're trying to achieve across multiple problems.
Yeah, thanks. We have only a couple of minutes to go, so I have seen 2 questions at least. So I make now a small round and then we can finish. Is there, who else is willing to have a question? Here, Bert Willems.
Okay, so two speakers mentioned sort of the role of innovation. And I was wondering, what's the role of, let's say, standard innovation policy like patents? Because on the one hand, we want maybe weaker patent protection, because then we can have all countries, all those small islands can use this technology to reduce the CO2 emissions. And at the same time, you see people that say it's a long-lasting problem. The current patent system is not well designed because the benefits of the patents only come in the future. So they're arguing actually for longer patent life. And sort of stronger intellectual property protection. But this might also lead to sort of problems with trade, where maybe some countries create a national champion, and then it might actually be harder to get to an agreement on reducing carbon. So I was interested in your views.
Okay, thank you. Very clear question. I have two questions, really short, because we're running out of time.
One thing is for the effective climate policy. One is there are 3 imperatives. One is it has to move the carbon peak, emission peak. It has to advance it. And the second one is it has to support the decoupling, particularly the decoupling the emissions from the economic growth. And third one is the recoupling. It has to include the social inclusion. From that perspective, will the carbon pricing will be a silver bullet, or do we need to think about other policy instruments?
Thank you. And here is, I know.
So this question is for Caroline. What are the options for developing countries, since the upstreams, obviously solutions are not available there, and downstreams, when you think that for subsidizing some of these solutions, many countries are relying on revenues from fossil fuels.
Okay, who wants to respond? 3 questions, yeah? Caroline, the last one was certainly for you.
Let's start with the last then. I think that's a great question. An underlying assumption in the graphs that I presented is that for a variety of reasons in developing countries, you don't have the mechanisms for intervening directly, and that's why it matters that what the policies are designed in the big players. Yeah, I mean, you can get a lot of the benefits by supporting deployment of clean technologies in developing countries. And the question is, do we have the right means of doing that? Do we have the right incentives for countries to support that directly? You know, clean development mechanism has not produced that much, and I have another paper thinking about, well, what incentives do these folks who are selling the technologies maybe have and may care about global emissions, and so, you know, they will be willing to contribute to some extent to deployment in developing countries, but not enough. So we really need a proper framework, and this is what, you know, I think the global negotiations are about, in getting enough focus on clean energy access in developing countries.
Okay, you take the patent question with you?
I thought he summarized it really well.
The trade-off, you mean?
That's that's really the issue, and I think we need more creativity in terms of more direct support and for R&D in transformative technologies, and not just relying on the market. The market, if the potential revenues are close enough in the future, then the market may do a pretty good job. But if they're long off, if there are a lot of spillovers, then patents don't really get you that much. And you summarized very well the trade-offs between the distortions that patents create versus the incentives that they do.
Okay, maybe the last point for the thing on inclusion, social inclusion, and the other questions. Who wants to answer to that question? Ian, maybe? Or Michael?
I was just going to comment on the innovation.
Oh, okay, that's okay.
Well,
Yep.
well just quickly.
Short, because we have 2 minutes left.
Okay. Well, yeah, just quickly on the point about the appropriate instrument to promote R&D. I mean, I think that's an important question. To what extent do you rely on patents versus upfront subsidies versus... I don't think we've paid enough attention to another approach is just to offer a big prize for innovators who develop some new technology. A patent doesn't work very well when it's easy for other firms to just make imitations of the patent and imitate around it. But it seems to me that we ought to look more about the possibility of technology prizes for carefully tailored innovations.
And yes, I was going to say, you summarised. I think at least there, is now a real debate in that community about the pros and cons of patents. And that's all we need, is a good debate to recognise there are good arguments and there are problems in that they then inhibit review, etc. So it's fine. As long as that debate is being honest and recognised, that's fine. I don't see so much debate around the equivalent in trade, which was also asked, which is that the problem we're dealing with here, and maybe it's not a massive problem, but it's all the trade theory is based on broadly second domain equilibrium reasoning, and it's great in that world. But if you are trying to transform stuff for the global public good, which is going to require a lot of subsidy in the way that German consumers paying 20 billion euros a year, actually they discover a lot of the revenues going to Chinese companies. Do they have a legitimate trade concern? I mean, they found a solution, but boy, was it a messy one. In climate policy, we published a paper, including one of the Commission people who said, if you think we've solved this problem, think again. We found some sticking plaster to stop it blowing up. But the underlying question, how should the world fund strategic investment on a big scale in a ways compatible with trade, has not been solved. And finally, just on the comment there about fossil fuels, it's always important to separate instruments from the problem. It doesn't matter whether you're at carbon price or anything else. Solving climate change is going to reduce global consumption of coal and probably oil, at least. That will have distributional consequences. But my only comment is I think now the fundamental change is we're no longer in a world where it's rational to say, oh, we have coal resources, therefore must use them for economic development. Well, what about your solar and wind resources? They're just as valuable. Why is it better to leave one untapped and use the one you used to use last century because that was the only way you knew how to do things? That is what I think is so fundamental about the technological change, is it's also changed the resource discussion.
Okay, thank you for the panel. I think I posed a challenge at the beginning, and if I summarize very shortly what I've heard myself, that there's hope. So I would like to thank Caroline, Ian, and Michael. And there's a final word of our chairman of the International Energy Economics Association.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you may have seen my little stumble over there, and it's an interesting circle at our very first meeting in 1978 in Washington. One Charles Mylander leaned back too far in his chair and went off of the dais onto his back. We thought it was a heart attack. It was just uncoordination, and so I've committed another act of that. Well, on Monday morning, I wished us all a successful couple of days at this conference. I can, with an absolutely clear conscience, say we've had 3 very successful days. How do you measure a successful conference? I mean, the whole purpose of these is to create a platform for high-level debate on critical subjects. That is absolutely what I've seen happening this time. In the background of that, we're running an association, and we've been doing a lot of meetings that have dealt with issues. And again, I think we've been very successful. We found common ground on a number of issues. We're moving forward. We're planning the next conferences. We hope to see all you in Montreal for the international, and at several of the regionals that we have coming as well. And there's the personal side of things, the ability to sit down with some people that I've known for longer than I want to admit, and people that I hadn't met before. And in all cases, the sort of commonality, as I said, the family feeling, the professional family that we have in the International Association of Energy Economists comes through that. So with that, I will close the conference and wish all of you safe travels home, and hope to see all of you again soon.